The year was 1914. The war had not yet reached the village of Wolka. It existed as a rumor first, a distant thunder that the men dismissed over their evening pipes, a headline in a newspaper that arrived 3 days late, a name on a map that meant nothing to people who had never been further than the next town. Wolka was a small village in eastern Poland, caught as it had always been between empires that could not agree on whose land it was. The Russians said it was theirs. The Germans said it was theirs. The Austro-Hungarians had said so too once. The people of Wolka said nothing. They planted their fields. They buried their dead. They kept their heads down and hoped that history would pass them by. It did not. Her name was Marta Kowalska. She was 31 years old, the wife of a blacksmith named Pyotr, who had been taken by the Russian army in the first week of mobilization. She did not know if he was alive. She had received no word. She had stopped expecting any. What she had instead were 9 children. Not all of them were hers. 3 were her own, ages 4, 7, and 9. The other 6 belonged to neighbors whose parents had fled, been taken, or simply vanished in the chaos of the first weeks of the war. Marta had not planned to take them in. She had simply opened her door one night when she heard crying in the street and had not found a way to close it again. By the autumn of 1914, she was feeding 9 children from a cellar that had been stocked for 3. She managed. She always managed. Until the morning the Germans came. It was October when the front shifted. For 3 days, the sound of artillery had been moving closer, a slow tide of iron and fire rolling across the flat Polish plain. The Russian soldiers who had been quartered in the village left without a word one evening, taking with them 2 horses, a cart of grain, and whatever food they had not yet consumed. The villagers watched them go from their windows. No one said anything. The next morning, the Germans arrived. They came in long gray columns, moving fast, their faces set and unreadable beneath the brims of their helmets. The officer in command rode a dark horse. He stopped in the center of the village square and looked around with the expression of a man calculating the value of what he sees. Then he gave the order. Marta heard it from her kitchen window. She did not speak German fluently, but she had grown up near enough to the border to understand the important words. Evacuation. 48 hours. Take only what you can carry. She looked at the 9 children sitting around her kitchen table. The youngest, a girl named Zofia, was eating a piece of black bread and watching Marta with large, calm eyes. Marta looked back at her. Then she looked at the window. Then at the door. Then at the floor beneath her feet. She made a decision. They would not be leaving. The cellar beneath Marta's house had been built by her husband's grandfather during a different war, a different occupation. It was deep, deeper than the usual root cellar. It had been dug with the specific intention of not being found. A false wall of shelving, stacked with empty jars and old tools, concealed the entrance. The actual door was a low wooden hatch cut into the stone, painted the same gray as the surrounding wall. Marta's husband had shown it to her on the day they moved in. He had said, "In this part of the world, you always need to know where to hide." She had laughed at the time. She was not laughing now. She moved the children in 2 groups after dark on the first night. She told them it was a game. She told the older ones the truth. She carried the youngest on her back. The cellar was 4 meters by 6, low ceiling, 1 small ventilation shaft cut through the foundation stones, no wider than a man's fist. She had already moved down what she could. Blankets, candles, the last of the preserved food, a bucket, 2 jugs of water, a small icon of the Virgin Mary that had hung above her mother's bed. She settled the children in the darkness and told them to be quiet. Then she went back upstairs. She could not stay in the cellar. If she disappeared completely, the Germans would search the house. A missing woman was suspicious. A woman going about her ordinary business was invisible. So she stayed. She cooked what little food she had on the kitchen stove. She swept the front step. She nodded to the German soldiers when they passed. Twice a day, when the street was quiet, she descended to the cellar. She brought food. She brought water. She emptied the bucket. She answered questions in whispers. She told stories to keep the children calm. Old stories, her grandmother's stories, about a girl who outwitted the devil by asking him 3 impossible questions. The children listened in the dark and didn't make a sound. On the 3rd day, they searched the house. 2 soldiers, young, efficient, thorough. They went through every room. They opened the wardrobe. They looked under the beds. They tapped the walls in the kitchen, listening for hollow sounds. Marta stood in the doorway of the kitchen and watched them work. Her hands were folded in front of her. Her face was still. Inside, she was counting. She was counting the seconds since she had last gone down to the cellar. She was calculating whether Zofia, who had a cough she could not fully suppress, would be quiet. She was thinking about the icon of the Virgin and whether prayer was a reasonable strategy at this particular moment. The soldier with the rifle moved toward the shelving unit along the back wall. He ran his hand along the jars. He looked at the tools. He pushed the shelving unit slightly. It moved perhaps 2 centimeters. Marta spoke. She said in her broken German, "My husband built that. It is very heavy." The soldier looked at her. She held his gaze. He let go of the shelf. He said something to his companion. They moved to the next room. Marta breathed, just once, deeply. Then she folded her hands again and waited for them to finish. The Germans stayed for 11 days. 11 days of gray uniforms in the street. 11 days of muffled voices through the floor. 11 days of twice daily descents into the cellar with whatever she could bring. The food ran out on the 7th day. She began trading. A silver brooch that had been her mother's bought 2 loaves of bread from a neighbor who asked no questions. Her husband's 2nd pair of boots bought a small sack of dried beans. She gave away nearly everything she owned that could be traded without raising suspicion. She kept the icon. On the 9th day, Zofia's cough got worse. Marta sat in the cellar that night with the child in her lap. Her hand pressed gently over the small mouth during each coughing fit, her own face close, whispering, "Shh, shh, shh," like a rhythm, like a prayer, like the only thing left in the world. The child's eyes, wide in the candlelight, looked up at her without fear, only trust. It was the trust that was hardest to carry. On the 11th day, the Germans left, not all at once. First the supply wagons, then the field kitchen. Then the soldiers in their long gray columns, moving east, following the front as it rolled away across the plain. Marta stood at her kitchen window and watched until the last of them had passed out of sight. Then she went to the cellar. She moved the shelving unit. She opened the hatch. 9 faces looked up at her in the pale light. Dirty, thin, exhausted, alive. She said, "It's over. You can come up now." The older children climbed out first, then the middle ones. Then she reached down and lifted Zofia out last, carrying her up the steps and into the kitchen, into the thin October light that fell through the window like something newly arrived. The child looked around at the ordinary kitchen, the stove, the table, the swept floor. Then she looked at Marta. She said, "Is this still the game?" Marta set her down on the kitchen bench. She said, "No, the game is finished." She turned to the stove so that the children would not see her face. She stood there for a long moment. Then she lit the fire and began to make what food she had into something that might pass for a meal. Outside, the village was quiet. The street was empty. The square was empty. The blacksmith's forge was cold and dark, but the smoke was rising from Marta's chimney, and inside, around the kitchen table, 9 children were sitting in the light. Marta Kowalska remained in Volka through the rest of the war. She is not recorded in any official history. Her husband Piotr returned in the spring of 1919. He found the house in order, the tools on their hooks, the jars on their shelves, the icon above the door. He asked her what she had done during the war. She told him she had managed. He believed her because he knew her, and because in this part of the world, that word carried the weight of everything that could not be said. Leave a comment. Would you have stayed? Subscribe. A new survival story arrives every week. Next, one man, Alaska, 1898, 60 days alone.